Good morning. Can everybody hear okay? Yep. Okay, well, welcome to the Amram Scholar Series. My name is Leslie Maitland, but I'll have more to say on that point in a moment. I'm delighted to introduce you today to Dr. Kirsten Fermaglich, who will discuss her groundbreaking research on the history of Jewish name changing in America. She's a professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University, and her engaging new book is entitled, with a nod to Shakespeare, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. As it happens, Jewish name changing dates back to biblical times. The Torah tells the story of our first patriarch and matriarch, introduced as Abram and Sarai. In Genesis, we read how God, making the holy covenant with our forefather, informs him that his name shall no longer be Abram, but Abraham. And as for his wife, God orders, henceforth thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. Small but meaningful changes. 2 generations later, Isaac's son Jacob wrestles with God, who then tells him, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Many Jews in 20th century New York City embraced name changing itself as a means to overcome struggles, to escape the boundaries that American anti-Semitism imposed upon aspirations of social belonging and success. That was precisely the case in my own family, and so Professor Fermaglich has encouraged me to tell you the story. As a child, I was confused about the fact that our last name, Maitland, differed from that of my father's immigrant father, whose last name was Friedman. Eventually, faced by my questions, my American-born father would reluctantly explain that he had changed his name by way of court order in 1941 to avoid the sort of anti-Jewish prejudice that he feared would hinder career advancement. He claimed to have found the name Maitland by throwing a dart at a map of the world on the wall of a bar where he was drinking with friends. It was a town to the north of Sydney, Australia, and he thought the name, originally Scottish, had the right sound for the restricted domains of engineering and business he wanted to conquer. I should note that my mother, who escaped the Holocaust from Germany, routinely opined that she would have preferred the name Friedman. She said that accompanying my father on business trips to the Midwest and Far West, she often suffered people who, never guessing that she, a Maitland, might be Jewish, voiced openly anti-Semitic views in her presence. This made her so very uncomfortable that she took to wearing a golden mezuzah on a necklace for the rest of her life, thereby announcing her identity up front in the hopes of avoiding insult. Kirsten's study of Jewish name changing in America is the first history to be written on this subject, and A Rosenberg by Any Other Name won the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Book Prize last year. Overturning many family mythologies, it explains name changing as a voluntary behavior that had a lasting impact on American Jewish culture. Kirsten is also the author of an earlier book, American Dreams and Nazi Nightmares, and she is co-editor of the Norton Critical Edition of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. She's a co-editor of the journal American Jewish History, and she comes to us today in cooperation with the Jewish Book Council. Now in closing, I'll add a little tidbit to my story. Just a few days after my father's birth, his sister Mona Friedman, who was 12 years older, ran to the New York City registrar's office to change the first name her parents had given her little brother. She changed Louis to Leonard, which she judged more elegantly American. As we learned from Professor Fermaglich, however, first names were then indeed subtly coded, and my class-conscious aunt did not fully grasp the nuances involved. Leonard, it seems, was a name that no non-Jew at the time would have chosen. Mona, however, was not alone. Thus, we had Leonard Bernstein and Leonard Schneider, better known and well-remembered as Lenny Bruce. With that, I remind you to please silence your cell phones, and I present Dr. Kirsten Fermaglich.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that fantastic talk. And you've already given, and just your family history really introduces my talk. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm honored and thrilled to be a part of the Amram series. Thanks too to Lainey Weiss, who I hope is in here somewhere. Thank you very much for all the help, and Joe Gottesman as well. Thank you for all your help in navigating and helping me be here. I also have to thank virtually my entire family who is here as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for all your support, and most of all, thanks to everyone in the audience for coming out on a gorgeous Sunday. I really appreciate it. So I want to start off my talk with a question, which is, how many people in here have a name-changing story in your family? Raise your hand and keep your hand up. Okay, that's like half the audience. Yeah, about half the audience. Okay, keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. How many people have a name-changing story like of a friend? Like they know someone who's a friend or someone, keep your hands up. Also a friend or someone, okay. How many people, keep your hands up, how many people have read a book or seen a movie that has a name change in it? And okay, all right, so almost everybody. Anecdotes, jokes, folklore, family stories about name changing, I think have really shaped our vision of name changing. In fact, so much so that when I started this project, there was nothing written about name changing at all. And so I went into the archives pretty much, I think, having a lot of the stories and images that we all share, I think, that are a part of kind of our family lore, our family heritage, and our popular culture heritage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by sharing with you 3 of those stories, and then kind of talking a little bit about the research that I actually did. I'm going to say for people who came in late, if you're sitting over there, I am going to use the screen. So if you can't see it, you may want to move or not sure how well it'll work. So do let me know, okay? Okay, so I want to discuss 3 popular images of name changing. Does it work? Can you see? Okay. If not, please do sort of move over. Okay, so the first story comes from Edward G. Robinson's memoir, All My Yesterdays. An immigrant from Bucharest, Romania, Robinson changed his name from Emanuel Goldenberg as an 18-year-old drama student. When, quote, and this is from his memoir, it was suggested to me ever so tactfully that Emanuel Goldenberg was not a name for an actor. Too long, too foreign, and I suspect too Jewish. And he says, although the thought of it was unpleasant, somehow a denial of my beginning, somehow unfaithful to my mother and my father and my 5 brothers, he searched for a new American-sounding name and adopted his middle initial G as, quote, my private treaty with the past. Okay, so that's one story. The second story is actually a very popular joke, and most of you will be able to tell it with me, so feel free. A Jewish immigrant enters America at Ellis Island, is processed according to the standard procedures like you see in the picture. They're very confusing to him. He's overwhelmed by the noise and by the bustle. And when one of the officials asked him, what is your name? He replied, hey, Shane Ferguson. In Yiddish, I've already forgotten. And the official then recorded his name as Sean Ferguson, or Shane Ferguson. Depends on which version of the story you know. All right, and if you don't know that story, now you have a joke that you can tell on the weekend. Okay, I'm just going to put that down there. So that is one joke, and that is the second story. The third story is actually a scene from the popular film Hester Street. How many people have seen that movie? Okay, a good number of people. If you haven't, it's a dramatization of the Abraham Cahan novel, Yekel. Yekel is an immigrant who has been in the country for several years, and he has tried to shed his old world life completely. He calls himself Jake. He takes on an American name. He prides himself on his Yankee clothes and his knowledge of American culture and English language. Upon the death of his father, he sends for his wife, played by Carol Kane, and his son. But he is embarrassed of their greenhorn status. He shuns his wife for a beautiful, more assimilated woman. And his wife is confused, rejected. And the name change of both her husband and then her son plays an important role in this story of this man who basically tries to escape his past entirely and become an American, kind of shaking off the old world entirely. So I don't know if you know these three specific stories, but I would imagine at least one or two of them probably sound familiar to you. Maybe you know another movie star name change story, or maybe you know another Ellis Island joke. And although these stories are substantially different, they share one crucial similarity that I want us to really think about. They all emphasize name changing as a profoundly individual activity. In the case of Edward G. Robinson, and all movie star name changes, right? The name change is the act of an extraordinary individual, someone who's distinguished by talent or charisma or beauty, someone who's moving away from their community and their world into another sort of more privileged world. Immigrant Sean Ferguson's name change, on the other hand, was the result of profound isolation. Right? His name is changed because he's a lonely individual with no understanding of, no connections to his new culture, and because he had no one to aid him in navigating the system. Then finally, in Hester Street, name changing is identified with a shallow young man who wants to abandon his family and his roots and remake himself entirely in the new world. All three of these stories suggest that name changing was an act entered into by individuals who are isolated from, or escaping from, or even sometimes betraying, as we see in E.G. Robinson's memoir, feeling like you're betraying Jewish families and the Jewish community. So in contrast with these three popular images of individual name changes that I think, as I say, are pretty popular, pretty familiar, and are what I walked into the archives with, as well as I think a lot of us walk around holding in our heads, I would like to offer you another, actually much more common story of name changing in America. Okay. In 1932, in 1932, a man named Max Greenberger petitioned the city court of the city of New York to allow himself, as well as two of his 4 children, to change their last name to Green. To Green. You're welcome. One of Greenberger's grounds for the petition was that the name Greenberger is a foreign-sounding name and is not conducive to securing good employment as a musician. That was the chosen profession of his daughter. Another ground was that the name Greenberger is not helpful towards securing an appointment as an intern in a hospital, the chosen profession of one of his sons. Greenberger's petition was one of thousands that was submitted in the middle of the 20th century to the New York City Civil Court. Thousands of men, women, and children, like the Greenbergers, legally changed their ethnic-sounding names to less ethnically identifiable ones between 1917 and 1967, roughly. And until the 1980s, Jewish names were represented disproportionately among names being changed legally in New York City. Yet before my book, historians had not seriously studied the significance of name changing in American or in American Jewish life. Scholars of American life have tended to take name changing for granted, to refer to its existence casually, and as Leslie mentioned, my book is the first historical book on name changing in the United States, which I was kind of surprised by and kind of shocked by, because by exploring the actual practice of name changing in more depth, as my book does, I think we can understand so much more about the lives of American Jews. The fact that Max Greenberger was not a young single man seeking to escape his Jewish past and succeed in an elite non-Jewish world, nor was he a hapless immigrant caught by circumstances. He was instead a middle-aged father seeking to improve his family's economic status. And I think that illustrates the degree to which name changing was a voluntary group activity entered into by ordinary Jewish men, women, and children. In the middle of the 20th century in New York City, name changing was a strategy of class mobility that Jewish families embraced in large numbers. It really became something of a phenomenon. And ironically, I think that strategy illustrated Jews' economic comfort in the United States. The Greenberger children are not seeking manual labor, right? They're looking for good middle-class jobs, or musician is kind of a okay middle-class job, but they're not looking to get dirty, right? They're looking for good white-collar work. But this also illustrates Jewish weakness. An identifiable Jewish name was not helpful to securing good employment. Ultimately, name changing was a strategy that permitted Jewish families to attain and to strengthen their position in the American middle class. But that position came with communal disapproval and psychological cost. So that's an introduction to my work. I want to go a little bit into talking about how I did this research. I'm happy to talk more in Q&A, but I like to give people a little bit of a sense of how I did the research and where I'm coming to you from. So there's a picture of the book. You can see it here too. In order to do this work, I examined the name change petitions filed with the City Court of New York City from 1887 through 2012. So over a century worth of petitions. And I'm happy to talk more during Q&A about all the work I did in the archives. I should say my mother is here. She helped me with that research. I'm also happy to talk about my methodology. I'm happy to talk about how I chose who I looked at and how I did the process of research. It's important to note that I did look at other sources. I looked at archives of Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Congress and the National Jewish Welfare Board. But the bulk of my findings were really in New York City in these petitions. And so sometimes when I go outside of New York, people want to know sort of why I chose New York and what might be the comparison between New York and other places. So I can talk more about that comparison later during Q&A if you want, but I do want to sort of offer some explanation for why I did this research in New York. So one reason is that the records, the court was gracious, and I need to thank them, and I do in the book, for offering me very easy access to the petitions. I don't know if anybody in here is a genealogist, but if you are, it's difficult to look at a lot of these records, and so I got special permission to do so in New York City, which other places like Detroit were not willing to give me. And so that's a part of why I looked in New York. But another part of the reason is that I'm from the New York City area, and when I started this research, it was 2007. It's a long process, and that's my son, if you can see him. He was 2 years old at the time. He's very cute. And I did not want to leave him for the extended periods of time that looking at thousands of petitions over 100 years was going to take. And so I could bring him with me, and my mother and father could look after him while I was doing my research, as could my mother-in-law, who is also from the area. And so that was a great help and enabled me to do this really extensive research. And I also like to do this because I like to show that this was a very long process. That is my son last year. A daughter popped up along the way. She came with me to do research as well and was also babysat. So this is it's a very long and extensive process of research. It helps to explain why I did this research in New York, but I'm very happy to talk about what you would find if you looked in other cities as well, but I like to sort of offer that for people. The other thing I'd like to offer for you is to let you sort of to make clear that I am looking at formal legal name changing. So I'm going to go back to this picture for a second. So this is a voluntary activity that differs greatly, I think, from many people's understandings of name changing and frequently stories that they have in their own families about the name change, about how their names came to be in America. Many individuals believe that their families' names were changed at Ellis Island when their ancestors entered the country. Despite this belief, most genealogists and immigration historians argue that this kind of mass involuntary name changing that was required by Ellis Island officials simply did not take place. There's no record of it. There's no evidence of it. It actually went against the rules of Ellis Island. Even more significantly, if you look at this picture, and it's maybe a little bit hard to see, you can see that the officials actually have large books in front of them. Those are called the manifests. Those are the ship manifests that have the passenger lists on them. So they already have people's names. And so actually, in fact, when they are calling people up to be processed, they are actually calling people's names. And so here, if you look, and if you've done any genealogy research, or if you want to do any genealogy research, you can see these materials on Ancestry.com, and it may be a little hard, I'm sorry about the lighting, but if you look closely on any of these pages, you will see a lot of check marks. And that is what those immigration officials are doing for the most part, is they are calling people up and they are making check marks by people's names rather than actually writing names. There's actually not documentation really that's produced at Ellis Island. People don't walk away from Ellis Island with paperwork that holds them to a name. And in fact, American law does not allow this, actually. American law is very flexible, and that's a part of I'll describe a little bit more in detail later, but American law is very flexible in name changing. You can walk out of this room and call yourself a fluffy bunny if you want to. I actually found a petition where somebody changed their name to that. And you can call yourself that, and that's your name. So long as you are not trying to defraud anyone, that's your name. The government doesn't really have any power to change your name. You can take on any name you want. So there's really little to no evidence that there was mass, systematic, involuntary name changing at Ellis Island. And instead, there's much more evidence of voluntary name changing in court name change petitions like the ones I'm going to look at, and naturalization petitions, which I didn't look at. But there's all kinds of evidence of voluntary name changing. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about during this lecture. I'm happy to talk more during Q&A about this because I know it can be different from people's stories. And so I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like. All right, let me just take a drink and then I'll move on. So this book, and this is because I'm a professor, I need to give you an outline of where I'm going. You don't have to take notes. The book is divided roughly into 3 parts. In my head, I call it The Rise, the Politics, and the Fall of Jewish Name Changing in America. And in fact, I wanted that to be my subtitle, but the publisher wouldn't let me. So that is how I sort of structure my thinking about this work. And so that's how I'm going to structure this talk. So first, we're going to talk about the rise of name changing as a phenomenon, which is really during and between the world wars, between 1917 and 1945. Then we're going to talk about the politics of name changing from 1945 to 1967 after the war, both in and outside the Jewish community. And then finally, we're going to talk about the fall of Jewish name changing in the 1970s and in the 1980s, really through today. So first, the rise of Jewish name changing. Between 1917 and 1945, the numbers of name change petitions in the New York City Civil Court grew exponentially. So numbers went up. They doubled and tripled and quadrupled from the numbers. So from 1916 through 1946, it's about quadrupled the numbers of name change petitions. And this is, to a large extent, not entirely, part of this is because there is a growing government bureaucracy. This period during the wars is a key moment when the government begins to track people who need to pay taxes, serve in the military, work at a defense plants, or receive welfare benefits, right? As the Depression comes into being, as the New Deal comes into being, and then the wars, names take on much more social, political, and economic significance. Government begins to ask you, what's your name? And you begin to have to produce documentation in order to prove your name. Ordinary individuals then frequently find it necessary or desirable to change their names officially, to bother going down to court and change their name in order to avoid penalties and also to receive the benefits. And so that's why we see that's one reason why we see this major push during this moment. It is also true, however, that Jews are disproportionately represented in these high numbers, far out of proportion to their actual numbers in the city. So to explain this with more numbers, during these years, the numbers of Jewish petitioners in the city court is roughly about 50% of the name change petitions. And you might say, and people did say to me in the beginning, this is, Jews, there's tons of Jews in New York. Of course, the numbers are going to be high. But the Jewish population in New York City was only about 25 to 30% during those years. So the numbers of Jewish petitioners are already about double their representation in the population. And if you account for the fact that most name change petitioners lived in Manhattan, the disparity is even greater because the Jewish population of Manhattan was really between 14 and 17% in the middle of the 20th century. So there are far more Jews out of proportion to their residence in the city. And then really importantly and interestingly, no other ethnic group came close to Jewish numbers during these years. There are other groups. There are Italians and there are Greeks and there are Poles. People will sometimes ask me about that, but they don't show up in the petitions anywhere near the numbers that Jews do. So for example, in 1942, the total number of petitions submitted by people with Slavic, German, Italian, and Greek names, right? All of these other ethnic groups that you would find in New York, all of those numbers equal altogether about 1/2 of the Jewish petitions. So Jews are overwhelmingly doing this. So that's, to me, pretty interesting, and I'm going to come back and sort of try to explain why that is. But there was one other thing that I found really interesting and surprising in the petitions that I didn't anticipate, and that's what I was talking about with you earlier, is that large numbers of these petitions were filed by Jews, including their family members in some way. Parents filing for underage children, spouses filing with one another, adult siblings filing with one another, entire family units that might include aged senior parents, adult siblings, their spouses, and the children of those siblings. It was quite phenomenal. You might find sometimes upwards of 10 people on one petition. It was cheaper that way, but it also was significant that people wanted to change their names together. Women regularly engaged in name changing with their husbands, brothers, and fathers, and sometimes on their own as well, which I think goes beyond some of our expectations of what we might imagine. And children were consistently the key subjects in name change petitions. It was not at all unusual for parents to change their children's names while actually keeping their own names. And so what I would argue from this is that name changing is a family strategy. All members of the family were a part of one economic unit, and they filed name change petitions together in order to encourage their unit to thrive. The final point that I want to make, and I'm going to expand on this, is that the presence of so many Jews, really an extraordinary number of Jews, or far disproportionate, illustrates both the economic strength and the economic weakness of Jews at this time. And so I'm going to talk first about the strength. I'm going to talk first about upward mobility. I'm going to show a picture, which I will explain why this looks like economic mobility in a second. As I mentioned, New York law did not require that you file legal papers to change your name. All you had to do was use a new name consistently, and it's legally yours. So if you file, why would you file a petition then? Why would you bother to go down to the court and change your name legally? The reason is generally, I think, that you were concerned that somebody was going to be looking at your name on a piece of paper and possibly not giving you a job because of what your name looked like. Now, that concern is primarily a middle-class concern. So for one thing, it's expensive to file these petitions. You had to generally, you didn't have to, but in general, everyone did, hire a lawyer, file the petition, and put an announcement in the newspaper. That could come to, in those years, upwards of several $100s. So you had to already have a footing in the middle class to be able to even file one of these petitions at that time. But more subtly and more significantly, it was primarily white-collar workers and businessmen who worried that somebody would be looking at their name on a piece of paper or on a sign. So if you want to think about it this way, working-class jobs at this time would frequently choose people either based on word of mouth, right? Your brother would get you a job, right? Maybe your brother was in the union, your brother would get you a job at the union. You knew somebody who needed their house cleaned, right? You'd get a job that way. Or you might be chosen for a job based on an appraisal of your body, very frankly. If you're loading cargo on a dock, you might stand on a corner and wait for people to choose you based on how strong you looked. If you were, let's say, a domestic servant, you might stand on a corner in the Bronx and have people choose you because you looked like you would be strong enough to be a domestic servant in their home. So the need to change your name legally in the middle of the 20th century was primarily a white-collar need. A businessman's need to attract customers, a student's need to get into a professional school, a secretary's need to impress a potential employer. Jews' unusual position among immigrants at this time was that they had moved in large numbers from blue-collar to white-collar work by the time of the Depression. They were far more upwardly mobile than many other white ethnic groups, which made them the most recent immigrant money group with the most money available for filing petitions, and more importantly, most concerned about their name's appearance on paper. Those are the kinds of jobs they're looking for. At the same time, however, at the same time that we see this Jewish middle class strength, Jews are middle class, they're seeking good jobs, they're looking to get into schools, they're looking for, nice white collar, clean jobs. But it is also true that Jews are particularly concerned about what their names look like on a piece of paper. Public, institutionalized anti-Semitism was on the rise beginning in the 19-teens and the 1920s and spiking in the 1940s, in part because Jews are getting more jobs like these. This is my white-collar work job. But as Jews move into these white-collar jobs, both men and women, they find that they are being targeted because of their names, and they are being excluded from jobs because of their names. So I'm going to give you a couple of pictures to demonstrate this. So I don't know, this is, people on the side might have trouble seeing this. This is a help wanted ad from the New York World. Does anybody, what do you see in there that might be noticeable, that might not be something that you would expect today? Christian, right? You actually, so this is, it's a help wanted ad. It says Christian. Anything else that you notice? Sometimes people see other things. Boys, absolutely. So it's sex just segregated as well as ethnicity. Anything else? High-type Americans, right, which is also a code word for no Jews. You also can't see it because of the way that the PowerPoint kind of expands this image. There are also specific calls for Protestants as well, actually. This kind of help wanted ad was perfectly legal, not at all illegal in 1930s. Completely fine in America, and was in fact incredibly common throughout the 1920s and the 1930s. According to one 1937 report, 89% of large New York companies declared that they, quote, preferred Christians as employees. They sent messages to employment agencies, which was frequently how you got your jobs back then, that just don't send us any Jewish girls. We won't take any Jewish girls. Don't even bother sending us them. And this is the kind of world that Jewish applicants for jobs, both men and women, are looking at as they're looking for employment. Excuse me. This is going to be a little hard to see, but this is the same kind of exclusions are also developing at the same time in employment in America. So I use here John F. Kennedy's application to Harvard University, mostly because, I mean, it's a little fun, but mostly because it's actually accessible. A lot of times universities actually won't let you look at their application forms because, in fact, at this time, beginning with Columbia University, then moving on to Harvard University, and then really moving on to all universities, or not all, but many universities, especially in the Northeast, universities began to identify a Jewish problem in their universities and colleges, meaning that they had too many Jewish students. Columbia and Harvard actually did a study of their Jewish students. They literally went through, they looked at all these Jews, and they determined that one of the things that you might know about them, that the way to keep them out would be to create an application form that would identify the Jews and then allow you to exclude them. So they begin, before 1917, Columbia's application to get into Columbia was a half a page. You only had to say, like, where you lived, what you got on the Regents exam, what your name was. Beginning in 1917, 1918, Columbia introduces an 8-page application form, right, that begins to ask questions, and this is one. Harvard adopts it later, and so these are some of the questions that we can see from the JFK application. Questions like, when and where was your father born? What's your father's occupation? What's your mother's maiden name in full? And these are very specifically questions. People will ask about this because this still shows up in our college application forms. We still see these things and they feel natural to us, but actually they were explicitly and completely created to keep Jews out. That was their purpose. And of course, the third question is particularly interesting, right? Because it is very explicitly identifying name changing as something that will help us know who the Jews are. Sometimes the question might say something like, has your father or has anyone else in your family changed their name? Asking about maiden names, asking about changing names was a way not simply to try to find that Jewish name, but also to literally identify name changing as a way to figure out who the Jews are. And in fact, Harvard did this by looking through their student body and determining that many of the students had actually changed their names. And so that was a good question to be asking in order to be able to exclude Jews. So clearly in this kind of environment, Jews are particularly concerned about what they look like on application forms. And application forms are being developed in order to exclude Jews, to create questions, to begin to identify and mark out the Jews, and literally make what your answer is to these questions the sign that you are a Jew. And then by the 1940s, we see that there are pervasive rumors. The World War II actually really intensifies a lot of this anti-Semitism and brings it into full swing. There are pervasive rumors that swirl everywhere in the United States, insisting both that Jews had manipulated the country into war and that they were war profiteers who would not fight. So if you were, say, perhaps in the military, or if you worked at a defense plant, or maybe you just lived in New York City, or you had a relative who did any of these things, you might get a letter from them, or you might just see on a subway this poem the first American. It would be like on a little leaflet that you might find on your seat, or you might find it in the newsletter. First American killed in Pearl Harbor, John J. Hennessy. First pilot to sink a Jap ship, Colin P. Kelly, and I apologize for the racism of that era that would call Japanese people Japs. First American to sink a Jap ship with a torpedo, John P. Buckley. Greatest American air hero, Butch O'Hare. First American killed at Guadalcanal, John J. O'Brien. First American to get 4 new tires, Abraham Lipschitz. Right? So it's funny, right? It was definitely seen as a joke, right? But it also illustrates the ways that Jewish names were vehicles for anti-Semitism, right? Nothing in this poem says Jew, right? It uses a Jewish name to kind of mark out and identify who the Jews are. And also, frankly, the humor itself is a form of hatred, right? Abraham Lipschitz is a funny name. It is an object of ridicule for no reason other than its presumed Jewish nature, right? It marks out this belief that Jews are profiteering from the war. It uses a name that is supposed to sound funny as a part of its kind of anti-Semitic goals. When Jewish groups protested this poem in things like military newsletters, the U.S. military, to its credit, shut it down officially, right? It said you cannot use mimeograph machines, you cannot reproduce this poem. But a lot of commanders, a lot of sort of the lower level people or the employers that Jewish groups would take this to would say, this is just a joke. This isn't funny. This isn't anti-Semitism. This is just funny. Which is frequently the way that anti-Semitism worked in this moment. And it absolutely helped to create a feeling for Jews, ordinary Jews, of being watched because of their name, being targeted because of their name, and being hated and humiliated and excluded because of their names. And so we can see this in the petitions that I looked at. Petition after petition lodged at the New York City Civil Court hinted at the forces of anti-Semitism that limited petitioners' lives. So Doris Sarietsky, a stenographer and typist, testified in 1937 that, quote, "My name proved to be a great handicap in securing a position. In order to facilitate securing work, I assumed the name Doris Watson." And then she got jobs. Bertram Levy, the president of a mail chute corporation, explained in 1932 that, quote, "His name has been a hindrance to him in his efforts to gain an entrance to various firms and to secure business from them." These petitioners never mentioned anti-Semitism or their Jewish identity. In general, almost none of my petitions did. Actually, it's funny. The only ones that did were 2 Catholic guys who had Jewish names, which is true. They had Julius Kaminsky and Leo Goldkopf. But they say very clearly, I have not been able to get a job because employers in New York City think I'm Jewish and I can't get a job. And so people have told me if I change my name, they'll be able to recommend me for jobs. And so they change their names. But they're the only ones who mention that they're Jewish. But instead, we see hundreds more Jews, right, not saying anything about their Jewishness, but clearly noting that they go around from place to place. And with a name like Sarietsky or Levy, they can't get a job anywhere. Okay, let me just take another drink. So what I want to do now is I want to note, so this is a very common, widespread thing that is going on. People know about this in the Jewish community before and during World War II. But for the most part, there's not a great deal of criticism about it. It is something that people, Jewish, leaders kind of know about, but kind of hush to the side. I want to talk about the politics of name changing after World War II. After World War II, the organized Jewish community responds in a more kind of forceful and a more anxious way after World War II. So after the war, name changing emerges really as a public issue, something that moves into sort of a larger non-Jewish space. Name changing continues at high rates, which is something that maybe people might be surprised by. I think we tend to assume that in 1945, after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism gets a bad name and anti-Semitism in the United States disappears. It is not the case. In fact, 1946 saw the highest number of name change petitions throughout the entire 20th century, over 1,000 in 1 year. And Jewish petitions represented over 50% of those petitions. Again, far and away more than any other ethnicity. And even as name changing declined after 1948, the numbers are still high, and Jews are still disproportionately represented throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. Which suggests to us, I think, number one, that anti-Semitism doesn't just, magically disappear, and I think everyone is even more aware of that now. But that also that people are very worried about anti-Semitism, right? That this is still a real anxiety that pervades the Jewish community after World War II, and that if there is any reduction in public anti-Semitism, it goes down quite slowly and not enough to allay the fears of a lot of ordinary Jews. After the war, name-changing becomes surrounded by much more intense communal anxiety and debate. So many Jewish leaders publicly call name-changers traitors. They say they are trying to pass out of the Jewish community, that they're trying to leave the Jewish community, basically, by changing their names. There's a discourse, like a language, about self-hatred that emerges in psychological literature in the 1940s. And it argues that high-status Jews are frustrated by their inability to integrate with Gentiles, and they turn that frustration against themselves and against other Jews. And you see rabbis and Jewish secular leaders and writers and artists of all kinds popularizing this image of self-hating Jews. And they suggest that Jews who change their names are self-hating and that they are looking to escape the Jewish community. And as soon as they have a chance to do so, they will do so. And certainly that they are betraying the Jewish community. And again, you see this in public magazines that everybody's reading, not just members of the Jewish community. At the same time, you also see Jewish name changers publicly defending themselves, saying, I do this in order to be able to work. I do this in order to be able to sort of manage my life. It doesn't mean that I'm leaving the Jewish community. And this debate is happening pretty openly out in public. So what I want to do is show you a couple of examples of the way that this debate sort of shows up in popular culture and in sort of Jewish life. So first I want to talk about how Jewish communal leaders are kind of openly talking about Jewish name changers as passing out of the Jewish community. So in 1945, Rabbi Milton Steinberg wrote a book for Hillels on college campuses. And he basically says, Jews who travel in elite circles near Gentiles want nothing more than to cease to be Jews, this is his language, to cease to be Jews and to be accepted as Gentiles. When this desire becomes great enough, he says, Jews change their names, dissociate themselves from their fellows, calculatingly conceal their origin, and try to pass, right? And you want to see how name changing is kind of a gateway. It's like the first place, the first signpost that you take on your way to leaving the Jewish community. Probably the most popular image of this kind of image of self-hatred is in the movie Gentleman's Agreement and the book as well. How many people have seen this movie? Okay. Oh, pretty good. But if you haven't, go see this movie. It's a really great movie. It comes from the novel. I like movies, so I tell everybody to watch movies. It comes from the novel by Laura Z. Hobson, who is a Jewish writer, and then it was turned into an Academy Award-winning film. It's the story of a Gentile journalist named Phil Green who goes undercover as a Jew to expose anti-Semitism. And he experiences every possible kind of anti-Semitism you can imagine, right? A doctor won't treat his mother. He gets funny looks from people that he works with. He has trouble putting his name up on his apartment building. He gets kicked out of a hotel. His son gets beaten up at school, right? He sees every possible kind of anti-Semitism you can possibly imagine. And yet, the only anti-Semite that you actually get to meet in this movie, the only person you actually meet and get to know, is this woman. She's played by June Havoc, and she plays his secretary, Elaine Wales. And she tells Phil Green when he starts this research, that she had changed her own name in order to get her job, that the magazine he's working at itself is anti-Semitic and discriminates against Jewish secretaries, won't let Jewish girls in as secretaries. So that's one scene. He is upset about this. He goes and talks to his boss, and then she comes back to him a day later and says, how could you do that? How could you change the policy? If you do this, they'll be letting all the wrong kinds of Jews in, right? And it will ruin us. It will ruin our own position here. Here she says, "If they just get one wrong one in, it'll come out of us," she confided in Phil. "Don't you hate being the fall guy for the kikey ones?" It's one of the only actual slurs like this that you hear in this movie, and it comes out of the voice of a Jew, right? A Jew who is seen as so self-hating that she's willing to use a slur against herself, and she's willing to attack and discriminate against other Jews in order to preserve her own protected position. So this film, I think, illustrates for us, and there's lots of other images that I could show you, but there's a real way that name changing looms large as a form of self-hatred, as and one kind of step to leaving the Jewish community at this point. I want to note, though, that in my petitions and in other kinds of materials I saw, in unpublished correspondence and even in published works, I actually didn't see a lot of Jews who were changing their names, who were leaving the Jewish community. I did see 1 or 2 per year Jews who are marrying somebody who's non-Jewish and converting. And they say this openly, you know, I've married a Catholic girl, we're going to raise our children Catholic, and it's not appropriate for me to have the name Cohen. I do see stuff like that. But what I see much more were people who make clear that they're not abandoning the Jewish community. They just want to be able to get jobs and be able to work easily through their world. So in response to one author who criticized name changers in the elite magazine, The Atlantic Monthly, a woman named Beverly Winston, who had changed her name from Weinstein years before, wrote, "I don't consider my new name a camouflage or an evasion because I never pretend that I'm not Jewish, nor have I ever had the desire to do so." She explained that she viewed her new name simply as a piece of acceptable clothing, like a corset or shoulder pads or a sincere tie. In 1952, the Jewish journal Commentary published a widely cited article, Name Changing and What It Gets You. Journalist J. Alvin Kugelmass went and interviewed 25 men and their wives, people who had changed their names in the New York metropolitan region. And this to me is a really fascinating article because before I started my work, everyone cited this one article as the evidence of people name changing. It was the only one. But what's really fascinating is that Kugelmass basically reports that he is very surprised that his interviewees have not passed out of the Jewish community in any significant way. He says, "In no case could I sense even the remotest inkling of a wish to abandon their Jewishness." Right, which is really interesting because it's both letting us know that that's what he expected, right? He walked in there anticipating that they would be abandoning their Jewishness. And also it lets you know that 25 people randomly interviewed all say, no, I'm not abandoning. And in fact, they're actually really defensive and they insist, no, I'm president of my synagogue. Like, I'm totally still Jewish, right? They're really, really anxious to get on the phone with them and prove that they're still Jewish. And so by the end, Kugelmass has this really interesting observation. It was obvious, he says, that they were seeking not so much to escape Jewishness completely as to live a dual existence in which their private lives would be Jewish, but their exterior lives would be as smooth and even as they fancy the Gentiles. Right? They wanted to use their new names to be able to work within a new world that was slowly accepting them to give jobs. But also, they still wanted to stay Jewish, right? They still had friends and family members and community that they were still a part of. So I think this account is really important for showing us both what people are assuming at the moment and also kind of the realities of what Jewish name changers' lives actually looked like. I also think it's really important to note that Jewish civil rights organizations, maybe surprisingly, took the side of Jewish name changers. I'll explain that picture in a second. Or at least they understood that their behavior was a response to anti-Semitism. So they didn't see them abandoning the Jewish community. They understood that name changers were doing so because they were facing anti-Semitism. So I think that that's what that quote says. So Jewish groups like the American Jewish Congress in the 1940s and the 1950s worked together with African American civil rights groups like the NAACP to introduce and lobby for civil rights legislation at the state and federal levels. And in fact, I mean, it's interesting that my research is in New York because New York was the first state in the nation to successfully pass an effective anti-discrimination law. This is before the 1964 Federal Act. And then it's one of the first to prohibit discrimination in higher education in 1948. And what's really interesting is that in both pieces of legislation, both of those pieces of legislation, both for employment and higher education, application forms that ask discriminatory questions like, what is your mother's maiden name? Or what changes have been made to your name? Became specific named targets for the legislation. New York's 1945 law against discrimination in employment specifically mentions discriminatory application forms. And the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee that is set up in order to be able to administer this law begins to gather thousands of application forms in an effort to determine if any of them are discriminatory. And it rules that to ask a question about name changing is inherently on its face discriminatory. All of this is really shaped by Jews' experiences with name changing and their action in these civil rights groups where they themselves have seen name changing as a part of the Jewish community and these application forms as a part of the discrimination against their fellow Jews. And then in 1948, and this is the picture that I have up there for you, when New York passed its law against education discrimination, what's really fascinating is that that law, basically what it does is it sets up the State University of New York. And this picture that I have for you that I'm not sure if you can see really well or not, this picture comes from the first annual report of the State University of New York. And what it basically does, it's like an announcement. You know, we are anti-discriminatory. That is the basis of this university. And to show you how anti-discriminatory we are, here's an old application form with questions about religion and father's occupation and the maiden name of your grandmother and your grandfather. We're going to circle all of those questions. Those are all discriminatory questions. And instead, look at our nice new application form that doesn't ask any of these questions, right? Discrimination at this moment, shaped by Jews' experiences with name changing and with these application forms, it has shaped legislation and it winds up actually shaping legislation throughout the nation, actually, and anti-discrimination Supreme Court decisions, honestly. Okay, so what I think that you can see is the ways that name changing really comes to shape the Jewish community. It creates a lot of communal tension and anxiety. It also helps to shape Jews' understanding of themselves as they fight for equality in America. Okay, so finally, I want to move on to talk about the fall of Jewish name changing during the last 30 years of the 20th century. The success of Jewish civil rights activism, the passage of laws like the ones I just talked about, as well as much more, even more upward mobility of the Jewish middle class and migration to the suburbs, Jewish migration to the suburbs, leads to a significant decline in name change petitions in New York City Civil Court by the 1970s and the 1980s. From 1962 to 1982, the numbers of Jewish petitions declined by half. And between 1987 and 1997, there were no recognizable Jewish names at all in the petitions. So Jews really fall out of the petitions altogether. It's worth noting that the petitions themselves decline. So when Jews are not doing this, nobody's doing it, right? The numbers decline altogether as Jews stop doing this. So ironically, just as the practice of name changing fundamentally disappeared from the lived experiences of New York Jews, it actually flourished in the cultural imagination of Jewish artists. Jewish artists begin to create novels and films and theater that all show name changers not simply kind of betraying the Jewish community in the way that we saw Elaine Wales in the 1940s and 1950s. Name changers in the 1970s and 1980s are almost exclusively men. There are no more women. And they all are illustrated as businessmen who are kind of embracing and symbolizing the corruption and the degradation of American culture itself, the entire what people would see as kind of the phoniness of the American dream, and leading to really the destruction of their families. So this comes from the movie Avalon. People seen the movie Avalon? Some people, yeah. So filmmakers like Barry Levinson use name changing to symbolize this kind of hollow or destructive American middle class. So as Levinson describes the journey of the Krasinski family in Baltimore from these immigrant roots to move on to their suburban lives in the 1960s and 1970s, one of the key signposts of this shift is the decision of two of the cousins of this family, Izzy and Jules, to change their names to Kay and Kirk And it's that move that helps to symbolize and helps to enable their move to the suburbs. It infuriates the patriarch of the family. And it ultimately, by the end of the film, winds up helping to signal the loss of the family itself, right? The Krasinski family, along with their Jewish heritage, kind of disintegrates by the end of the film, right? They become trapped in this kind of flickering meaningless of a television screen. And that name change was crucial in kind of destroying this family, right? This cohesive ethnic family becomes destroyed by the end by individualism and consumerism that is all kind of symbolized in this name change. And not only Levinson, but lots of other people portray an image like this. And in all of them, Jews' real experiences with anti-Semitism, right? With the discrimination that led people to change their names originally is not mentioned, is completely forgotten, as are the experiences of women and children, who are some of the main people changing their names. All of that is forgotten. The other thing I want to show or talk about by the end of my book is the actual experiences of name changing in the 21st century. By the 21st century, name changing has become really an entirely different phenomenon. It is still a phenomenon, though. Between 2002 and 2012, the numbers of petitions double. They go from over 1,500 to over 3,000. So name changing today is really is still a phenomenon in the New York City Civil Court. The numbers are huge. Unlike in the 1940s, however, when Jews had been disproportionately dominant, there's not really one ethnic group that is doing this. There are a few smaller exceptions, and I can talk about them during Q&A. There's an interesting story to be told about Muslim Americans and Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in particular. But for the most part, New Yorkers are changing their names roughly in proportion to their existence in New York City. No group dominates name changing or is making name changing into some kind of distinctive ethnic group behavior. It doesn't look like Jewish name changing anymore. And then maybe even more importantly, I'm going to hold off on this for a second and just say something. Maybe even more importantly, most of the ethnic groups who are changing their names are not doing so to advance in the middle class. Indeed, the demographics of name changing changes by the 21st century, so that it's poor people rather than middle class people who are changing their names now in large numbers. And I write here, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, in a post 9/11 world, it's actually poor people, not upwardly mobile people, who have to worry about what their names look like on a piece of paper. So I'm going to show you a few maps to kind of illustrate this. It's really striking. So in 1946, this is a map of what name changing looked like. And I don't know if you can see the dots are where the name changing is. In 1946, roughly 40% of petitioners lived in census tracts where the median income was $3,000 or more. And another 59% lived in areas where the median income was between $2,000 and $3,000. That's roughly middle or upper middle class during those eras. And you can see where those dots are. They are mostly in middle class, mostly in Jewish neighborhoods, Upper West Side, Washington Heights, things like that. Only 1% of petitioners at this time lived in areas where the median income fell below $2,000, which was a threshold for poverty at that time. So this is not something that poor people are doing, and I've already kind of explained the reasons why that is, right? This is an image of what this looks like in 2012. By 2012, only 27% of petitioners lived in census tracts with the median income of New York City, roughly about $50,000. Even more striking, roughly 54% of petitioners in 2012 lived in census tracts where the median income fell below the city's poverty level, under $31,000. So clearly there are many more people who at least live in very, very poor neighborhoods who are the ones who are changing their names. This shift is partly a response to legal and administrative changes in New York City. The court actually wants to make its petitions more available to poor people. So it does things like eliminate the fee for name changing. So you no longer have to pay a fee. You no longer have to get a lawyer. You can now do it online, right? So they've done a lot of things to sort of increase access. And so they're increasing access to poor people, which you can see is a good thing. But it is also true that in the wake of 9/11, and that is a tragedy tragedy that unfurled in the immediate vicinity of the Civil Court. So it's only blocks away from where I did my research were the Twin Towers. And it actually, 3 security officers who worked at the court where I did my research were killed in 9/11. And so every day when I went in to do my research, there was a memorial, their pictures were up, and we passed flowers and things that were left there for them. So this was a key part of the city history, but it also inspired a new obsession with security and surveillance. And after 2001, I think that these name change petitions, certainly the map that I'm showing you, suggest that it's poor and working class people who bear the brunt of this anxiety over security and surveillance. There was a significant rise in the number of petitioners who sought to correct bureaucratic mistakes on their vital documents. So in the earlier years of the 20th century, roughly like 5 to 10% of people, maybe even less, changed their names because they had a bureaucratic error, a misspelling, a forgotten name, something wrong with their birth certificate. Between 1997 and 2012, those numbers doubled. Between 15 and 25% of petitioners changed their names for the same reason, right? And we're frequently talking about very small bureaucratic changes. And I would argue that it's primarily poor people who needed identification to cash checks or to access government benefits that seem to have needed to change their names for these bureaucratic reasons. They don't have the help of personnel departments or university degrees, right? Things that smooth the lives of middle-class people if you happen to have a mistake on your birth certificate. And I've talked with some of my students, for example, who face no trouble even as their names on their birth certificate don't match their university records. But poor and working class people found themselves unable to access the basic things they needed, like Social Security checks or Medicaid benefits. Whereas in the middle of the 20th century, it was primarily middle-class people, and primarily Jews, who had to worry about people scrutinizing their names on application forms, right, when they went to go look for employment or education. At the beginning of the 21st century, it is primarily poor and working-class people, primarily African-American and Latino people, whose identities are scrutinized as they struggle to set up bank accounts or find employment. And poor people of color living in New York don't have the possibility of changing their names to escape those racial designations or maybe find higher paying white collar jobs. So in short, name changers today face state surveillance that is far more intense than what Jews faced in the 20th century. And they also face definitions of race and class that are more rigid and not necessarily going to change if people change their names like Jews did 70 years ago. So while I want my work to correct the cultural myths of Jewish immigrants having their names changed at Ellis Island, I do not want the story of Jewish name changing to become a new myth that people of color today might be asked to live up to, because we really live in a different world. Okay, so I'd like to leave you with a few conclusions, and then I'm really happy to take any questions during Q&A. So my first conclusion, name changing is not a joke, but there are very good jokes. I'm happy to hear any jokes that you have. And it's not just for famous people, although there are many famous name changes as well. Name changing reflected substantial anti-Semitism in the United States, as well as upward mobility. It shaped the Jewish community throughout the 20th century, even as the phenomenon also created conflict and tension within the Jewish community. And it looks very different today than it did in the 20th century. And so thank you for coming. My children say thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the fascinating presentation, and we look forward to asking questions, I'm sure. But please excuse a momentary diversion before we turn to the questions, as this is the moment, as everyone knows in our program, where we present our coming attractions. And we have 2 more Scholar Series programs planned for the spring, so please do mark your calendars. On Sunday, April 19th at 10:30 a.m., we have the Jewish American Paradox, Embracing Choice in a Changing World, with Harvard Law School professor Robert Mnookin, who discusses our Jewish American future. Having achieved unprecedented influence, he says, how can we confront divisive challenges, including intermarriage and conflicting views on Israel? And finally, on Sunday, June 7th at 5 p.m., beginning with a festive reception and celebration of our year-long lecture series, this program will feature Professor Paul Mendes-Floor of the University of Chicago and Hebrew University. He's the author of the first major biography in English in over 30 years to focus on the seminal modern Jewish thinker Martin Buber. Titled Martin Buber, A Life of Faith and Dissent, it is part of Yale University's Jewish Lives series of accessible biographies, so please join us. Now, as Professor Fermaglich will take questions from the audience, and we'll have a microphone going around, and she will be signing books in the atrium after the program, and we thank you. So starting things off, I'll just ask you a quick question here. You know, the reasons that you give in the book sound so plaintive as one after another of you outline the petitions that people present for name changing, almost giving the impression that they feared that their applications would be turned down. So was there any instances in which their requests were denied?
That's a good, so can people hear? I haven't tried this. Can people hear? Okay, all right. So that's a really good question. Were people turned down? Not that I saw. So it is entirely possible that most of what I saw was the things that were accepted. So there have been a few historians, or there's one, not a historian, there was a folklorist who found one example of a judge turning down a group of name changers actually during World War II, saying that actually the government has an interest in knowing what the ethnic identity is of its citizens at a time of war, which was very interesting. But I didn't see very much evidence of that. There were some judges who castigated name changers. So there's a great example of a judge, I believe named Lewis Cohen, who accepted the petition of a salesman named Lewis Cohen to change his name. But he also said something like, you know, let the, you know, the golden calf never worshipped, you know, at the feet of a Cohen. Let him change his name and be done with him, or something like that. So there were things like that. So I think that people were hesitant about going in front of Jewish judges, but more because of social disapproval rather than because of rejection. People were rejected for like not doing the ads, you know, like if you forgot the ad or you didn't fill out all the paperwork. But I didn't see much evidence of people being rejected.
Just as an aside, in this morning's Washington Post parade section, they had a large group of celebrities' names, their original names, and you were supposed to match up to their name changes.
Oh,
so I thought that was
that's
kind of
so
funny. It was in today's paper.
Oh, that's so interesting.
I was going to ask about your last name, the origin. Did anybody in your name? Because it is hard to pronounce. I wouldn't have known how to pronounce it.
Yeah. So I have my mother in this audience who does our genealogy. We believe that it means possible money. It's Yiddish or German derivation. We're not sure, actually, to be honest with you. But I think that's where it is. It was not changed, which you can imagine. But it have a slight different spelling. So it was V-O with an umlaut, right? M-O, okay, O-E-G. So it's slightly spelled differently, but yeah, that's as much as we know about it, I think.
Okay, we have a question over here.
It doesn't matter.
Okay, at first, as an aside, I went to Columbia about 1960, and at that time, Columbia and Harvard were the universities in the Ivy League with the highest percentage of Jews at that point. But my question is a little bit offbeat, which is, the recent death, and I'm referring to the Washington Post reference today, Kirk Douglas, his name is, my father was brought up in a small, poor town in northern New York, Amsterdam, with him about the same time. Always referred to his name as Isidore Dembski. However, in reading the New York Times obit not that long ago, it sounded as though he actually made multiple name changes before he became Kirk Douglas. He had an impossibly long name. Isidore Dembski was the convenient name, finally, before Douglas. So my question is that, how unusual is that to have multiple name changes? Even I realized when it became Kirk Douglas, that was something separate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So how common was it to change name? I think that it was probably more common. Yeah, multiple times. I think it was more common than we realize, absolutely. I think that happened, you know, along the way, again, voluntarily, but people would sort of, you know, change spelling. Our focus on spelling in particular is something that people, say, earlier in the 20th century didn't necessarily always have. Things were written by hand. You didn't have computer forms where you were putting things out. And so the difference between an I and a Y, people might, you know, spell it differently like that. But I believe that people probably, I didn't find a lot of evidence for that because that wasn't what I was looking at necessarily. necessarily, but you can sometimes see in name change petitions today where they make you write down a number of different things that you've changed your name from, and they will mention sort of a number of different names that people would have taken on. So my guess is that that wouldn't be completely unusual.
Hi, I'm wondering about the Rosenberg name in your book, because to me that brings memories of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, whose children changed their name because of the scandal associated with their last name.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. People have asked me whether I've seen a lot of, whether I saw during the Rosenberg, during the trial and after their execution, whether I saw people with the name Rosenberg changing their names more. I did not see that. I didn't see people particularly, moving out of Rosenberg, and nobody mentioning the trial as a reason why. I did see people with the name Moskowitz, sort of reflecting the, not wanting Moscow in their name. And Oppenheimer, also when the physicist Oppenheimer was being considered a communist. I didn't do, so I should say, my research, just because I didn't see it doesn't mean there aren't any in even New York City. So I looked, I had mentioned, I couldn't possibly look at all of these thousands, so I used a sampling technique. So there may have been a few people who did that I just didn't see, but I didn't see any. But it's a good question. And people did, the Cold War did shape it, for sure.
Did you have any experience with people changing their names back? I had an experience like that with someone, and I wondered whether, Jewish people then adopted their ethnicity and went back.
Mm-hmm. So this is a really good question. People ask me this question, I think, every time I speak, which is really interesting to me because the answer is no. I saw almost no evidence in my petitions, right? Or maybe like one or two. So maybe one or two by the 1960s and 70s in the more recent years, right? Or even today. No, I saw almost none. I saw like a couple of Italian names in the 1970s, no Jews. I found anecdotally, so the book does address a few people, both famous people. People might know Irving Wallace's son, who took the name David Walachinsky to sort of reflect his father's earlier name, or his grandfather's earlier name. So I talk about some of those famous people. I think that there are a few. So I was saying, like, I live in Michigan, and when I did talk to people in the Michigan and the Detroit Jewish community, and everyone was like, well, people change their names back, but they all have the exact same one example. There is one example in Detroit of Don Cohen. He changed his name back. So I think there's a couple of people. I don't think it didn't happen, but numerically, it's not very significant.
Hi there. I was interested in what you were talking about. You go back, it seems mostly the Ashkenazi community that's doing it, and I was also thinking about it that many of the people from Russia, from Poland, from Germany had their names changed back then.
Yes.
And it's really interesting that that stereotypical Jewish names are not really Jewish names.
So there's a number, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's really important, and there's a lot to kind of delve into with that. So absolutely, Jews take on names. So, 2,000 years ago, people didn't have last names, right? Last names are a product of modern states trying to develop and get taxes from people. And Jews, because they were kind of isolated and excluded, did not take on last names when everybody else did, and they took them on at a later date. And because of that, and that's a part of where we get Jewish names from, stereotypical Jewish names, Ashkenazi Jewish names, people took them on when they became a part of the state of Russia or Germany. And so they are usually names, this is kind of contrary to what people imagine, they are names that Jews frequently chose themselves. They weren't, most historians believe that they were not given to them as ugly names. They chose them themselves, but they do look different. They were following a particular pattern and style that identified them as specific Jewish names. I have certainly seen, I have a really interesting letter that was also written to David Cohen, the person that I listed who wrote in the Atlantic Monthly. And she wrote, why shouldn't we change our names, right? Why should we experience hatred and discrimination for names, that aren't, that don't reflect our religion. Why can't we keep our religion and just change our name? Which to me, I think it's definitely a piece of the reasoning why people are kind of thinking about this or justifying it. But it does also identify that these Jewish names kind of identified and marked people, and they were things that people wanted to get away from because of what they identified and marked. They didn't want to get away from Jewishness, but they wanted to get away from the marking of that might expose them. Right, and I think that might be true, but it also did reflect them as Jews, right? And the fact that they're going from a name that looks like Rosenberg to a name that looks like Rose, or a name that looks like Greenberger to a name like Green. They may not care about the name, but it is certainly signaling that they don't want to be marked as Jewish publicly, or that they don't want that particular kind of identification. Can I answer that if he's not on that? Sorry, I'm not hesitating for your question. It's just that you don't have the microphone. If everybody can hear, he said that. What about their legacy? That they're losing out on their legacy. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of sadness, certainly in the way that people, sometimes even in the way people approached it then, and certainly in the way that children and grandchildren today sometimes reflect it now. And I think certainly you can see in the communal tension, there is a lot of sadness, there's a lot of anxiety. And I mean, I say to people, one of the most poignant documents that I looked at that I wasn't able to put in the book is that if you were to go to the city court and look up your own ancestors, say, if they changed their names in New York, the first place they would take you to would be the index. So you go to this index and it lists all the names that are being changed. And what you see is long lists of Jewish names, right? You see pages of Cohens and Goldstein. When you go to the C's and you see pages of Cohens. And you go to the G's and you see pages of Goldbergs and Greenbergs. And you see pages of Rosenbergs and Rothsteins, And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a loss there. I absolutely think there's a loss there. I don't know how much the individuals themselves, I mean, I don't have a lot of evidence that the individuals themselves personally always felt that. You do see some evidence of that, but there's definitely family and community sadness about it for sure. And I think it's worth thinking about as a larger way, yeah.
So related to the prior question, isn't it true that a lot of Jewish people, when they came here, they didn't actually have last names, so they just took the name of the place they came from, or like Goldstein, isn't that gold? You're a gold worker, or Silverstein. Is that true?
So not necessarily when they came to the United States. I mean, it depends on when they came to the United States. But by, say, the 20th century, if they're coming in like 1900, 1910, most of them probably already have last names because they've been sort of incorporated already as citizens in the U.S. So, but that is a process that takes place earlier. It takes place like a generation or two earlier in Europe. But it's not a process of American.
And they took those names like from the place they lived.
Sometimes, yeah, they would take a place from their trade or the place they lived, or as in names like Goldstein or Goldberg, they were what was called, although that's seen as a discriminatory title now, like ornamental names that sounded beautiful, names that brought together elements of nature or things like that that were seen as attractive. They were stylish names to them, but they marked them as Jewish.
Thank you.
Sure.
First, it's interesting. I congratulate you as a historian finding a new niche to explore.
Thank you.
And I can imagine the work that
got me promotion. Thank you.
Is this an American phenomenon? What can you say about in other countries and other cultures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I was not able to do a study. I mean, I think it would be a fantastic study to be able to really do something that would be more comparative. I would say that I think you can see similar things in, say, England or in France, but those cultures are more limited in their allowing people to change names. So actually, there was recently a really fascinating case of French Jews, and I don't want to mess up the details, but a friend of mine told me about a case of French Jews who had changed their names after World War II to more French-sounding names and then petitioned the government to change them back. The government didn't want to let them change them back because the government, I mean, France is very much more controlling than the United States about what you can name yourself and what kinds of names you can take on. And so they had to specially petition to be able to be allowed to change their names. So I think that's one way in which the U.S. is really, in some ways, distinctive, is it's much more flexible about name changing. However, the other really interesting place to think about comparison is Israel. I don't know if anybody here is Israeli or knows anyone Israeli, but really at the same time that American Jews are changing their names to take on kind of American sounding names, or at least, names that won't make them embarrassed in the American middle class, the same thing is going on in Israel, really pushed by the government. The government is equally kind of embarrassed of these Jewish sounding names, Silverstein, all these names that sound like diaspora and sound like weak Eastern European Jews, and they are encouraging, and sometimes it's not clear whether it was actually law or whether it was truly required, but indeed there was policy that if you were going to represent the state of Israel, you had to take on a Hebrew name. Now, there are people who flouted this, but nonetheless, the government very, very strongly tried to encourage new immigrants to get rid of these embarrassing sounding Eastern European names and take on names that fit the nation better. And so it's a fascinating comparison. I've talked to Israeli historians. I don't read Hebrew, and so I couldn't do that research, but I think it's a really great question, and there's a lot more space for doing that kind of research.
Hi, thanks very much. I have a question of a slightly different slant. I came today, I'm not a usual, and I came because I thought your topic was really interesting, and I was thinking historically and academically, my grad school stuff is all in identity and name changing. Mm-hmm. You were about 5 minutes in, and I switched completely to what I was thinking about. I work in the management and the HR sphere.
Okay.
And we are currently reconciling unconscious bias, which took over from conscious bias recently, and so, it's harder to find, it's harder to name, it's harder to point out, and it's harder to get rid of because it's not quite as obvious as some of your examples from the 30s and 40s. And I'm curious, anti-Semitic bias hasn't gone away. It's changed slightly to being more impacting on Muslims than Jews. Name bias has not gone away at all. And so I was wondering, especially when you got to the part about the university applications, removing the questions about name changes speaks to the title of your book, but you've still got names on things. And we talk a lot in my sphere about, do we go blind on promotion considerations or on hiring? I know it's catapulting us into 2020, but I'm curious what you think about with your background.
I definitely, when I was doing this research, I absolutely was looking at things like, I believe England, right, for civil service jobs. You would probably know this better than I, but I believe that they made the decision to not be looking at names, right, mostly about gender bias, I thought it was. Rather than about ethnic bias. That was what I remember reading. But no, I think that's really fascinating. I mean, I think it absolutely, I think that you can still continue. I mean, when you think about, say, discrimination based on names, I think you now can think about discrimination based on distinctive African-American names. I mean, there's been a whole host of social scientific research about the impact of the name Lakeisha, and Jamal. There's a famous article about this, the impact of the name of Lakeisha and Jamal versus, Emily and John, or whatever the standard sort of white names are. There's been tons and tons of research about this, and so I think it doesn't go away. I mean, I think it's a really important and still very alive debate. There was a famous YouTube, by a guy named Jose, who does a whole YouTube, like, what happens when I get rid of the S in my name? All of a sudden he starts to get jobs when he didn't, because he becomes called Joe. I think there absolutely is still name bias in a whole host of ways, and I think it's really an important legacy. I think it's an important element of this.
But all the more amazing that Barack Hussein Obama could be elected in the wake of 9/11.
Yeah, no,
really
absolutely.
amazing.
Question, how do you access the petitions?
So if you have a family member and you want to, go look for your petitions, I did this research at 111 Center Street, which is now called the Civil Court. I misspoke a couple of times. It changed its name. It was City Court when most of my people were changing their names, and it became Civil Court like in 1962, which is confusing. But you can go now to the Civil Court, 111 Center Street. You have to stand online with people who are changing their names today. I mean, I did this when I did my research. I had to stand online and request my files materials. You know, it's an interesting place, and they will give you access to your file. So I didn't have that. I had to get sort of special permission because I had so many materials. But you can do that really easily. None of it is digitized, so unfortunately, you do really have to, you know, physically go there. But it's actually a fairly interesting experience to be there and to see people changing their names now. And it certainly shaped my own experience because I was there watching people and being with people as they were changing their names now. It absolutely sort of helped to shape the way I think about name changing today. Good luck.
As a historian, I have a bit of a problem with the how narrow your research is. Do you feel that if you had looked at rural areas and at areas across the country, you would have much of a different perspective on it?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and people have asked me about that for sure. And as I say, I think it would have been pretty hard to do this. The research that I have that other people have done gives us insight, I think. So there have been sociologists who in 1950s, I believe it was 1952, but I wouldn't swear to it, I have to go back and look at my notes, who published a work on name changing in Los Angeles. And they found very similar findings to what I found. Well, right. So hold on one second. Right. So they have to give you what has been done and what I would use. So there's been Los Angeles, and then there was also a sociological piece that was written in the 1960s about Minneapolis, and that similarly found that sort of high-status Jews were, you know, changing their names in larger numbers. And then I found a good deal of sort of correspondence and evidence from other large cities. So I think if I were going to make a guess, which is just a guess, and using those pieces of evidence, I would say that I think this probably would hold in other big cities. The only thing I can say about small towns, I would not necessarily say that it would hold in small towns. And the one person who has done research on small towns, Eva Moravska, found that that Jews who changed their names were more likely to leave the Jewish community and be absent after that. And so I would think that small towns, I mean, she's the only one, and she only looked in one small town. She didn't look elsewhere either. So I don't know what you would find if you did another study of small town Jews. But I would only say that I think that my findings are probably more applicable to other large cities.
So I'll leave one more question.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought this would follow Joan's comment, but I teach citizenship classes to immigrants, and I went to actually one of the oath ceremonies on Friday, and they emphasized over and over again if there are any mistakes or errors that they had to let them know then, otherwise it would cost them $650 for USCIS to make those corrections. But some of our students do choose to change their names. They don't get charged if they do it in conjunction with their naturalization, but it takes months. And reasons why they might do it is one case, a woman was divorced and she wanted to change it. Another case, when they came to the United States, they still changed the name other than what the person said their name was. So anyway, have you noticed any of that? Have you followed up on any of that?
So you could absolutely, so naturalization petitions became available as a place for people to change their names. And so in 1906, I believe. And so, so absolutely people change their names on naturalization petitions. Is that what you're asking me about naturalization petitions or? Right, so they don't have to pay, right. So and that is why it's, 70, so I wouldn't say that immigrants are not changing their names, but 75% of the people that I found are native-born Americans, which doesn't mean that immigrants aren't changing their names. It probably does mean that they're changing their names on naturalization petitions because it's free for them to do so. And so they are doing so because it's free. But what I think is really important about the research that I did is that native-born Americans, people who are second-generation Americans, speak English perfectly, go to American schools their whole lives, maybe have a New York accent, but otherwise are completely integrated, are all still changing their names in large numbers, which suggests it's not necessarily always about Americanizing, it's actually about the anti-Semitism and the hostility and the discrimination they're finding even as native-born Americans that I think is important.
So speaking of anti-Semitism, I'd just like to bring to everyone's attention a book that Kirsten mentions in her book, which is a small novel by Arthur Miller called Focus, which was also turned into a movie with William Macy and Laura Dern, which is a terrific story because it tells about a non-Jew whose ophthalmologist tells him he needs to wear glasses all of a sudden. And when he puts on glasses, everyone all of a sudden thinks that he is a Jew. And his entire life changes once people start thinking he's Jewish. And the professor mentions this story several times in her great book, and so I commend the movie version as well. It's very good. Arthur Miller, Focus. Well, this has been so very interesting, and I'm sure that Kirsten will be happy to speak with people out at the table as she signs books. And thank you all so much for coming and for this fascinating presentation.
Thank you all very much for everything.